I'm Matt O'Neill, former U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of cyber operations. In this series, I go inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from the defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead. Because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Today, we're diving into one of the most critical frontiers in technology, how we keep our data, our infrastructure, and our businesses resilient in a world of increasing intelligent threats. Today, my guest is Dr. Srinidhi Varadarajan, Chief Scientist at Elastio, a company pushing the limits of cloud-native data protection and ransomware recovery. Srinidhi's career spans from cutting-edge academic research to real-world systems that keep enterprise data safe. He's worked at the intersection of distributed systems, cloud architecture, and security for decades. And he's one of those rare thinkers who can talk about both science and the strategy behind the technology. It's a real pleasure to have you join us today. So let's just start with the beginning. Doing my research, you've had a fascinating journey from research labs to industry innovation. What originally pulled you into computing and system design? And how has that early curiosity shaped your approach problems today?
Really good question. Because the early part of my career in computing was in India. And in an era, the technology in India was several years behind. So we got computers years behind, and they were very rare devices. So I ended up with access at a local community science center, which got some of the first PCs. This was way back in the 80s when I was in my 9th grade. Back in that era, most of our software was shareware of one form or the other. And unfortunately, I ended up bringing a virus into that facility. And this was in my 10th grade, which basically meant I lost access to the facility unless I could remove it. So it was a do or die situation. Okay. I still remember Avenger really well. It was the first one I reversed in going through the assembly. And then built a product at that time. So this was during my 11th grade or so. It started selling by the time I was in the 12th. By the 12th, actually, the top management school in the country was my first major customer, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. The entire institute ran the antivirus.
Wow, that's really cool. So you were building antivirus software in high school.
Yes.
Okay.
So this was before McAfee existed. In fact, when McAfee came out, they first had a product called Scan. All it did was signature. It was the first signature scanner that you could use. So the interesting thing from my perspective was I had a product before them, but there was no validation. So now you could actually run McAfee. McAfee says, hey, there is this virus on this machine, and my tool comes and removes it. And you get before and after, essentially, with independent validation. Really helped sell for me.
Right.
It wasn't actually competition. It was quite the opposite. So I cut my teeth originally on DOS viruses, reversing them, building techniques inside there. At one point, actually even building all the techniques for a fairly sophisticated DOS virus, which we never released. So it was a very interesting time at that time because it was far more sophisticated. You had to directly modify a run binary by intercepting where the binary starts executing, attach yourself at the end, and this is all in DOS land. And if a machine gets hit, every single binary on that machine will get hit. And good ones can hide themselves for quite some time in those.
Yeah. No kidding. That's really cool. And what's something that resonated with me is when you said that there was no validation for antivirus. And now fast forward, we're still dealing with that as it comes to immutable recovery of. It's an interesting sort of loop that you've been on. Yeah.
That is correct. So I started in that area, sort of came back to that area after many, many years.
So a lot of listeners might not understand what a chief scientist actually does, whether it's at Elastio or anywhere. So for you, what does the role mean day to day? Like, what is your day to day, and how do you balance deep, long-term innovation with the sort of like the immediate needs of the customers?
This is a really good question. The first and simplest way I have found to do that is to actually talk to the customers firsthand. When I get something secondhand, there is some nuance that invariably gets lost, and you think like, why was I not on the call directly? So I do spend quite a bit of my time with customers. It represents probably a third of my time entirely. These days, I have a bit more luxury. The other third of my time to actually managing teams or managing models into everything that we have to do both in terms of short term, mid term, long term. And it's not just the size of the market and things. It is like, what threat are we going after? Are we improving some of these capabilities dramatically year over year? For example, we scan S3 buckets for ransomware. But now we're putting together something that actually does it in real time. You're 5 minutes behind in real time. You don't even lose the 5 minutes worth of data when the system
Right.
catches it. It comes back, it tells you, no, it's been versioned already. So this is a version. We're going to roll this whole thing back. Going more towards the prevention side of the space, but we have certain precepts in how we have been building these systems. And one core precept has been, want to be in a space where the same kind of exploit that works against someone else does not work against us.
Hmm.
So my security policy has been, I call this the corralling theory. No tool is perfect. No technique is perfect. So the question is, okay, do we just assume that this is Swiss cheese and it's never going to be fixed? Or do we do something? So what I tend to do is build, and the last year in particular, we tend to build systems where the holes of one are masked by another. So if you attempt to go through the hole of the one, you're plumb in the middle of the cleanest, easiest detection case for something else. So we build a set. Essentially, we want to corral the surface through which you can possibly escape by having layers upon layers of boundaries like this. And so many of our techniques are based on that. It's not that any particular technique is perfect, but the combination of techniques is very well tested. So the thing that we wanted to protect against was agent bypass. So this has
Okay.
been a big problem with every attacker. I mean, every single major ransomware exploit did have prevention mechanisms. The EDR got bypassed. That is not to say you shouldn't have an EDR. EDRs are excellent. You absolutely should have EDRs. But attackers are very sophisticated. Just takes one slip in real time and somebody's passed. And once they're passed, if they're passed at the right level, then there is going to be significant issues because you will be blind as the EDR to seeing that. So we wanted to be such that we never had agents.
In your experience, is one of the challenges of rapid adoption into protecting and monitoring backups because frameworks that are usually tied to spend are insufficient in today's era in combating cyber criminals?
Yes. Because one cannot put all of the eggs essentially in a prevent basket. Because then you're essentially saying, I've got these massive fort walls, but once the fort walls are breached, I've got nothing. And prevent is essentially the thing. In today's attack infrastructure, you have to assume the attacker is going to get through. And if the attacker is going to get through, what can you do to essentially be resilient to that? In that you can bring back your company's core assets, your minimum viable business, as rapidly as possible within hours. And in order to do that, you need to know at all given times, what is my recovery policy? How do I intend to recover? Those are now my crown jewels of my business. And I absolutely have to be sure of what goes in there and what comes out of there.
Well, and what you're doing to protect against ransomware is also just about business resiliency in general. It seems
That is
like
correct.
so many people always focus on, oh, well, if I got hit with a ransomware attack, well, what happens if you have some other natural disaster? You have some other thing that happens, or maybe it's
Correct.
an insider threat or something. So, do you also see that there's just sort of like a miscalculation as to what Elastio specifically will help you recover from?
That is absolutely true. As you pointed out, it is not just necessarily a ransomware attack that it helps with. One of the natural things do as part of how we operate is we inspect all the data inside your backups. We follow your backup schedule. You configure it in your backup system, we automatically pick it up. So now when we're doing this, is a health check of your entire backup system. You literally know what data is in there. And I can even tell you when a backup is actually corrupt. And we have had customers come back and say, fail the scan twice, and we can look inside and say, over 10,000 file system errors in there. You really do not want to be using this backup. So now your incremental chain is broken, so you might as well take a full. And the second part of it, produces a discipline to say, these are my assets, my core assets that I'm protecting. That is my minimum viable business, essentially. And this data, I need to know how quickly I can get to it. And at all given times, I need to know I have a copy that I can go back to.
So you mentioned earlier on about being able to be only 5 minutes behind. Can you explain to the listeners how speed has become so much more important over the last several years than it was maybe even 5 or 6 years ago, and why 5 minutes is such a critical sort of component today than it wouldn't have been before?
It's a really good point. So the reason is, previous, if you looked at the dwell time of most of the attackers, it was quite long. And if you actually look at the history of what happened there, the first few people were actually really good systems guys.
Mhm.
Meaning you need to know your way around the driver stack of the operating system. You need to know how to have basic bypass capability. And then you'll have to figure out how to do any kind of lateral movement in there. So now if I take this, you look at the first attackers, just guys, a bunch of guys together, each handcrafting an attack, coming into the system, looking around machine, and you can see the traces of all of this. It takes them days, sometimes weeks to even jump the first lateral machine. And the first target, obviously, to go is someplace where they can get some force multiplier effect out of it by, if it's a directory server, for example, then I can start really doing some interesting things include. And then people got cleverer. They started using the directory server to actually launch the attack because it has access to every machine. So you can do Vimy instrumentation and say, deploying, this is like fully deploying software, and the guy fully deploys the detonator essentially, doesn't even write his own command and control. But these were the ones where you had to handcraft your and then you own loaders and stuff like that. Now this has become much more sophisticated now because over time essentially everybody starts building shrink wrap software. The shrink wrap part of the attacker world is effectively there are entire tool chains that do loaders now. There are entire tool chains that do exploit identification, loophole identification, and automate the lateral movement chain. So you just run this piece of code, don't need to be there on the machine. And this is going to keep fighting, one after another.
So the barrier to entry for a cyber criminal is at an all-time low.
That is correct. And there are deal structures in place that essentially motivate this, right? And sometimes you'll find an attacker of not great sophistication came through some stupid vulnerability that didn't get properly patched or patched fast enough. And then they find that they're in a place that is bigger than they would be able to actually do any damage to. They cross-sell this in the market.
So you mentioned sort of like a lack of patching and stuff. So oftentimes when we'll talk to people about ransomware, they'll say, "Oh, well, it's just people that have organizations that have poor cyber hygiene, and if they just patched and they had everything up to date, they wouldn't have gotten hit." Can you kind of dispel that fallacy?
Yeah, that statement is absolutely not true. So yes, you can absolutely keep up on all of your patches and you could still completely get owned by something as simple as few seconds. Somebody did a git commit. In the git commit, forgot to take the key out of the command line and leave it in an environment variable, which is what you're supposed to normally do. But once in a while, somebody would have an example script and there is a key. It takes about 4 seconds before it's scraped out. And so now credentials. Your fully patched system. Somebody came in through a clean credential. Then comes the 0 days. Now, typically somebody is not going to spend a 0 day directly on you. On the other hand, if a 0 day is popular enough in a certain space, there have been known 0 days that have hung around for years that no one knew and were exploited for multiple years. And if you look at the history of 0 days, you should look at it as statistics. There is a very large surface area in there, and there is a lot of privileged software that runs on various systems. And a major 0 day pops every few months in the ecosystem. So this is just statistics. It's clockwork. It is getting better, but it's not something that's going to go to zero ever. It's just the nature of the beast.
So a lot of times people always sort of dismiss the tactics that bad actors have been using for a long time, and they say, "Oh, that's not sophisticated or whatnot." I always go, "Well, it's working." You don't get style points. So before we talk about like emerging attack patterns, what are some basic things that people can and should be doing in order to just not be the low hanging fruit?
A few, so it depends on the level after level, essentially. So if you're looking at either Windows or Linux systems, make sure that you're running them at the right level of security enabled already on the platform. Yes, sometimes just base operating system security, setting it up correctly is a bit of a pain in the neck. But one has to deal with the pain sometimes, because it will actually catch conditions that otherwise would simply slip under the covers. There would be no alert, no warning of any kind. Whereas machines that that are set up at a higher security level typically. So, for example, in Linux, it's fairly common to turn off SE Linux inside the platform.
Okay.
And because some application or the other is conflicting, it's a large beast and so on. On the other hand, SE Linux is quite secure and quite difficult to penetrate through, essentially. So these are some of the basic things in there. The other is always making sure your patch hygiene. Fourth part is supply chain. Be very careful of supply chain attacks and make sure that mechanism to ensure that your sources are not being poisoned. Because in many of the modern languages that development teams work with, you have some package management outside, and packages come from that package management system. And it also happens for various backend things, container registries that bring code into your system. Now, those depend upon source code that comes from Rust, Crate, or something else. And those source projects are in many cases open source projects. And there have been attacks in there wherein somebody left the bucket open for a short period of time. The same package that was there originally is still there, except now it is the attacker's package. It does the original package's work, but leaves himself a nice hole. So these are some of the things that become dangerous. And by the way, unfortunately, even patching sometimes is not sufficient. So I'm not going to name vendor names, but there is a recent one where where a firewall, an older version of a firewall, which was out of security support, had a vulnerability. Now, vendor released, no, this is very severe. So they actually went and did the right thing and released a patch for it. The machine still got taken. And the question was, how did that happen? This is patched. Is there some new vulnerability? No, there was no new vulnerability. The vulnerability had already been exploited. And what had happened was the user credentials had been exfiltrated out. So the next time when they came in the patch system, they know every user on that.
Do you find that end-of-life attacks are pretty prevalent, where people overlook the hardware, the gear?
That's correct. They do. And gear should be treated the same as software, whether you put it inside a virtual machine, call it a virtual appliance or a physical appliance of some kind. That gear does need to be maintained, because eventually there will be some attack in there that is severe from somewhere else. And this is just within the blast radius, because it involves some other tool which actually got exploited, for example.
So you've obviously been in the ransomware game a while, and you've seen it evolve, which is always, I find that kind of to be fascinating, because it's a business. And so the good guys do stuff to try to mitigate it, and then the bad guys do something else, and then we're always sort of trying to play catch up. From your vantage point, what emerging attack patterns worry you the most, and what do defenders still underestimate about this landscape?
So the kind of attacks, at least if you look at it from a ransomware perspective and the way they do encryption, they have been evolving in various ways. I mean, sometimes you'll see families arise together because, and then you wonder, like, okay, what was the cause of this? For example, about 2 or 3 months ago, we found within 1 week 3 new ransomware families, each of which had one property common. And the property was, every file they encrypted, they renamed it to a random file name and a random extension. Or they left the original file name there, but put a random extension at the very end of it. So question is why? Why are 3 of you choosing this technique? And then we noticed that Microsoft Windows Defender with some anomaly detection in there. And one of the anomaly detectors was, oh, do I have a lot of files of the same extension that I don't know the type of? Okay, because it's a fairly common thing for a ransomware gang to say .abc.locked or .docx.locked. So they were hunting for it, and so it seemed like a nice trigger. And of course, the immediate thing within 1 week was like 3 gangs going like, no, not so simple.
Yeah.
So every time detectors come, this kind of cat and mouse game happens. And for us, what we have learned over time is never rely on any detector. You have to have a complete model around this. And then you will have a series of different things that you're measuring that are quite different from each other. That is, you influence one, you cannot influence the other. You'd call them orthogonal parameters, essentially. So So we build models, and over time we even incorporate new sensors into it, because that's the only way we have found to stay ahead. If you want to stay ahead of a bunch of really smart people in there, then you got to have really large math.
Yes.
But then you can actually stay ahead of them, because the space in which we look at is way vaster than what they get to see. They see a few dozen things that they can change. We see hundreds of things in that pattern space, essentially. So even small signals are then visible to us. And that is what made our system strong. But that is the only thing we have found as a possible defense. And what actually worries me, and I'm sure a lot of people are talking about this, is essentially AI. And there are certain areas where you can get a superb jump with AI, particularly like lateral movement. If you get into a machine, I can put a reasonably competent systems guy with zero security background onto that system, and within an hour, I can get you a piece of code that essentially analyzes the logs inside the system. From there, figures out every single version of every single piece of software in there, figures out what are the open vulnerabilities, and probes very specifically for each of them. Okay. And it will look through all of the controls of your machine exquisitely. It will know your network firewall. It will know what not to trip. So you can build this on the fly, because earlier the cost of doing this in a general purpose shrink wrapped way across multiple attacks, it's basically a corporate size. So attackers don't go to that level of sophistication in some cases to build. But that said, though, now with AI, you can do very, very custom attacks that are that bypass defenses that are specific to that infrastructure.
So you can't have a conversation about fraud and cybercrime without talking AI. So I'm glad you brought it up. And we talked about the offensive landscape. What about the defensive landscape? How can Elastio explore AI defensively? Because you always hear people say it takes AI to defeat AI. Do you believe that to be true? And then do you think, are we, the good guys, adopting AI as fast as the bad guys?
That's a really good question. So on the attack side, AI's biggest gains come from the initial penetration attempt and the lateral spread of the infrastructure. Subsequently, when you do a ransomware attack, there's unfortunately some things you do have to do, which is you got to encrypt the data. You may not encrypt all of it. You might encrypt part of it only, but you do have to encrypt the data. Otherwise, you're not getting paid. So then mathematically, what you try to then do is figure out, can I just figure out if this data is encrypted or not? I don't know what encrypted it, but some mathematical properties that distinguish it. And so built a series of mathematical tests that do that effectively. And then even for various kinds of, what you call striped encryptors, where you encrypt 16 bytes, skip 16, encrypt 16, skip 16, stripe patterns and things like that. So, and this gives us essentially a layer that tells us, okay, we can at least detect what is happening underneath, however the bypass happened. Even if our models got bypassed, there is a bottom layer of truth that essentially says, now that is difficult to bypass, because what we are trying to do in there is like channel you into, there are certain operations you absolutely have to do, and I'm going to be standing right there because you don't have a solution around it easily.
So what about the sort of evolution of bad actors not encrypting, but just exfiltrating and extorting? What is your take on that?
It's well, let me put it this way, a little, probably more nuanced. There is one class of actor that is a pure ransomware actor. And these guys tend to explode really quickly. Like within hours, they will explode. Because their lateral movement tools are quick in many cases. They don't really go after hardened targets. There they will spend their time, because hardened targets typically have layer upon layer of like interim firewalls in between protecting application zones. Production doesn't look anything like test and dev. No easy lateral movement in there. So there are many different things that it's not in those cases, but in smaller cases, in a mid-sized company, for example, these attacks, even CrowdStrike says is like within an hour. There's no time to exfil anything there. In 1 hour, you're not going to speed of light at the end of the day. I mean, your WAN pipe will choke you out essentially. because these guys, that's why they have to stay below the radar as much as they can, Um, so the interesting thing, though, is in many of these systems, the initial part in there is automated.
Do you think that you're going to see more and more attacks that are bypass the entire encryption part and
And
just
just go to the Excel.
yes,
Yes. So one was pure encryption, which is pure extortion attack,
yep.
ransomware extortion attack. The second family, that is exfil, they take their time essentially in there, and they have no encryption. Currently a hard problem because there are several companies that play in that space because it requires a combination of technologies to detect it. It's probably one of the hardest problems really to go after. To do it correctly, multi-spectrum, because you have to do it on the network at the end of the day. But these systems you're talking HTTPS, secure traffic, right?
Yep.
So you have to man in the middle that with a proxy of some kind. And some companies have the security teams that can pull that off correctly. Others consider that to be a risk by itself, that they don't want anything internally being intercepted on an end-to-end communication. Um,
So you mentioned security and security teams, and one of the things we always talk about is having trade-offs, cost, performance, false positives. How do you think about finding that sweet spot where protection systems remain both effective and trusted by the people running them every day?
so one of the big things we focus on is exactly that, the false positives. And the reason for that is uh, exactly what you mentioned, which is you do not trust a system if the noise floor is too high. In many cases, the signal that you're going to see itself is within the noise floor. We have seen many systems like this where the signal to noise ratio is just not good enough. So the first thing we've always focused on is to give alert only when we absolutely have to, when we are very sure of what we are saying. And we can claim many nines of accuracy on that number because security teams are already overburdened. You should not be asking them to look through patterns in some graphs of 4 variables and say, oh, that is ransomware. Like, okay, did you actually train the team looking through the data to correctly be able to pinpoint out all the ransomware patterns, much like you would to train anyone from the TSA, for example. Here, no one knows what the pattern looks like. I mean, no one's feeding you that data. So you need models that are actually able to capture this information over here.
So if you, this is probably a very basic dumb guy question, but I'm a dumb guy. If you could redesign the cloud from scratch with everything you know today, what would you build into it to make ransomware possible?
Very good question. Um, if you wanted to make ransomware impossible, the simplest thing that you would actually do is build something like a versioning system.
Okay.
Every file system, everything is versioned.
Hmm.
So in the cloud, for example, objects in object store are versioned, and you can build a security architecture where an attack can be defeated 100% of the time. So what does it? Why is that so different? Because as long as you knew you got attacked over there, versioning allows you to roll back, and the attacker is just
Mm,
one version in a version chain.
okay.
Unfortunately, file systems don't have that property,
Yep.
and things inside the file system that hold information about files can be modified by anybody. So you can forge your way into it. Those are the weaknesses that allow you to make a ransomware attack and get away with it over and over and over again.
So do you think that in the next 5 years, or in 5 years from today, we're still talking about ransomware as a major problem for organizations? Or are you optimistic that with Elastio and with other potential opportunities to mitigate this threat, that bad actors will evolve? How do you see the next 5 years playing out?
That's actually a good point, and I really wish that statement were true. That hope that the problem would go away, and because security postures have improved over the last 5 years considerably, from what they were and to what they are now. Attacks haven't slackened off, unfortunately, and it just means they fail more. But once in a blue moon, they get through. And essentially, this as a business model, I don't think is going to go away. The malware industry has figured out how to monetize their skills, and the ransomware of one form or the other is going to be sitting in there. And data exfil is probably going to continue to remain a problem in there. Security will get tighter and tighter, so that basically means number of people um, getting attacked is not the same as before. Many targets would have made themselves too spiky to be hit, but there is a much larger pool of not as sophisticated teams. There, they're going to need tools to be able to help them, because otherwise, everything is being channeled to them. All the threat actors, that's only surface they see.
So one of the things that in a couple episodes ago, I was talking with some experts about cyber insurance and how modernizing the sort of evaluation of a company while providing cyber insurance to ensure that they have immutable backups. They have basically trying to choke out the ransomware groups by not paying them. Do you see
Correct.
that as a successful strategy to at least mitigate some of the losses?
Absolutely, I do. Um, and that we have actually seen play out in the field too. We have seen people refuse to pay the ransom simply because they went like, look, I am going to rebuild this because I
Right.
don't know what has been sitting here. Some have, in fact, treated that as a benefit because they've essentially gotten rid of like legacy systems that were hanging around uh, in the corner. And now, once you're under the
Yeah.
security microscope, everything is going to get questioned. So you end up with a nice, shiny new infrastructure with proper security controls in place. And yeah, that's what I mean by spiky targets, those that
Yes.
have had to learn after getting hit in there. Uh,
It also seems like many companies don't think it's ever going to happen to them until it does. Do you see that in your day to day where after
yes,
there's a big attack, all of a sudden your phone's ringing off the hook because it either hit somebody in the sector or it hit them to some degree? It just seems to be like they always have it's October is cybersecurity awareness month. And I always go, I think we're aware. This is not working as a strategy. Like we have to
exactly.
we have to do more. We have to do something different. We keep doing the same
Correct.
things over and over again. And so, from where you sit, what are those things that we can do today if you had to prioritize? And you're saying, look, I'm sitting on the board and I'm saying we're not paying a ransomware. Figure it out for ransomware. Figure it out. But we haven't gotten hit yet. What's
Correct.
the first thing that you would do to ensure that you're not going to be on krebsonsecurity.com as the latest victim of some big group?
Exactly. So if the thing that we have to typically impress upon them is, what is your strategy under attack? So phone rang at the wrong time on Friday evening and essentially says, come in, you're under attack. And machines have locked down, infrastructure is dead. What's your plan? Have that plan, because if you have to execute to that plan, you know what you need at that point in time. And essentially, this is your oh shit moment. You have to plan
Right.
for it. And it's not like this is some big surprise that only the 2020 hindsight could have, given you this epiphany that you needed to plan for this. No, that is cyber awareness. Knowing that you need to plan for this eventuality. And so making sure you exercise that plan.
So exercise, because you're right. When I was in the field, it was always Friday at 5:30. So or later, and it was usually going into a 3-day weekend. So
Yeah.
knowing who to call, not just I'm going to call the FBI or I'm going to call the Secret Service. Give me the name of the person. Give me their personal number. And have
Yeah.
I run that play enough? And have I evolved that play? Because some of the companies that I work with have built a playbook, but haven't dusted it off, and it's out of date. And that person that they were going to call has been retired for 3 years. So so the proper planning in your view is probably the most critical element for
That
speedy
is correct.
recovery.
That is correct.
What about the Super Bowl of finger pointing that happens after every event? Can
Uh-huh.
you mitigate that in the pre planning of a disaster?
Yes, yes, because the thing is, the attack is going to penetrate through your defenses at some place using some technique, um, and the space for that is really vast. EDRs protect one corner of it, network appliances, firewalls protect another corner of it. There are various systems in play. Patch management, vulnerability analysis systems play another part of that surface. But it's a very large surface area for the attacker to come through. Now, if the attacker came through and got all the way through to your data, then the consequences for you are much worse than if at least you had a plan that got you back up, you had optionality in terms of paying the ransom. Then you can go back and say, I did get through my outer defenses.
Yeah.
And next time it might not be the same way they come through, but it is but it is not it is not the biggest problem that you face right now. Your systems have come back to operational, so a very different temperature level from from both the business as well as the customer when one of those outcomes happens versus the other one, you know.
Yeah, it's an amazing sort of basic things that we can do that people say that they do until you kind of go underneath the covers and go, well, you kind of had the framework in place, but you didn't plan nearly as detailed as you need to be. Do you think some of it is, and it's getting a little off topic, but I'm really interested in your take on it. Do you think that some of it is the misalignment of where the cybersecurity or the security professionals are in an organization? So they're not necessarily getting the level of engagement at whether it's budget, human capital until something happens. Where do you see that? Do you still see that, like, there's a C suite, but the C suite's really the CFO, the CEO, but the CISO, CSO, not really only a name only? Or am I misreading sort of what you
Oh,
commonly run into?
so typically, the complaint we always get is they have a fixed budget. They have to prioritize essentially a set of things, and the budget's already eaten up by the existing layers of defense they've got. Uh, and then we're coming and telling them, no, guys, if you want to recover, you need to check your backups because you got no playbook at all there if
Yeah.
you're taken out. And the ransomware actor's first target is get your backup system down because that's when he knows he gets paid.
Mhm.
So he will try every technique, including poisoning techniques on the data, to make sure your backup is out of commission. But then what is the typical question we get back? That's a new layer of defense. So
Yes.
they're usually under budget pressure, essentially. Uh,
Which speaks to the recognizing that security is a cost center and trying to elevate all the awesome work that the CISO are doing to a much higher level because this is like a business survival. You could have an
that is
extinction
correct.
level event
That's correct.
inside cyber. And I think a lot of people still don't really appreciate that, like how devastating it could be to an organization. The other kind of piece to it that I'm interested in is we talked about the frameworks, how they're outdated, how they don't talk about backups. The question's going to be, do you have offline backups and are you updating them? Yes, yes. End of discussion. From what you see, how long can bad actors be in backups prior to launching an attack? And how does that change the dynamic as having updating backups and just maintaining them?
Really good question. Um, so within backups, depending upon the attacker, the most sophisticated attackers that do these delayed attacks. So there's a family in there that actually uses a file system filter driver. So it essentially installs a piece of inside the running operating system that is in the data path of all the data you're writing to disk or reading from disk. So now in that layer, what it is doing is randomly and in very small quantity encrypting data. So it does this for weeks,
Mm.
essentially. Now, of course, if one of your applications tries to read that encrypted data, um, it's going to get back garbage and probably explode and immediately start triggering alarm bells everywhere. So what do? They keep a decryption key in memory. And so if you read encrypted data, it will also decrypt it back for you. Okay.
Oh,
So
wow.
now what
Okay.
happens is you think everything is good, but your
Yeah.
backup systems, what are they seeing? They're seeing encrypted data underneath. And so he
Oof.
has poisoned your backups. And so it's become a fairly prevalent technique out there to essentially bypass various defenses. Such attacks, you can get weeks of warning on them. There's a major advantage in there. The second part of it is once EDR bypass has been achieved on an end host, sometimes there will be pieces of the file system that will not really be visible to the EDR in some sense. Um, and there is stuff left in there from loaders, intermediate parts of like payloads that it has brought in. And backup systems do pick those up. So we can sometimes see early stages of an attack simply by looking inside there and saying like, hey, we are seeing deposits of various things in here. And they had never seen that before because nobody had ever looked in there before.
Wow. So it really speaks volumes about the need to monitor backups because,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to your earlier points, if you're able to do that and you're able to recover, you don't have to pay the ransom.
Yep. For example, this year alone, we detected nearly 4,000 events of e-derivation that dropped malware. Yes, uh,
4,000.
4,000. And we are currently going through a large company and that has never scanned. And then they're starting to see like, oh my God, it's
Oh
quite a
my
bit in here.
gosh.
I mean, my security team today was telling me like 67 incidents in one account. We're like, what? And
Uh,
then we know it's a really large company and they've
yeah.
never done this. And I was like, oh my God, there is a lot of gunk in here.
Well, okay, on that note, we always like to try to end on a positive note. Give me something you're optimistic about in the next year, 2 years on our collective ability to counter ransomware.
So uh, the positive thing I think is enough of us are working in this space that the systems are actually getting good and can be deployed en masse to provide layers of defense that make an attack harder. So, and we want to make it such that the attack has to be hard enough that you are going to come only manually.
Okay.
Because you have automation in your attack, we will find the signatures of your automation.
Okay.
So it will get better. And my expectation is the prevalence will go down. But now the hits will be large, essentially.
Right.
Because they have to cluster and pool skills of many units in order to go after a fairly spiky target now. So that's my hope, at least, that the pace, the velocity starts falling, even if the revenue itself is climbing.
One of the things that I think is interesting from what you're saying is there's tools that exist today that can be deployed, but what the delay and lag time is if you're a CISO and you have to map your funding and it's a hard amount and you have to build it out several years in advance because you don't have any discretionary income or discretionary spend, then all of a sudden in 12 to 18 months you're able to afford to put in that defense in depth that you were talking about.
That is
And
correct.
then,
Exactly right.
okay, well, that's good.
Because at that point, if people stop getting paid, you realize, okay, as the attacker, what's the only choice left?
Right.
Make bigger companies with even more expertise needed to go
Yeah.
after a larger target. And that is it. The pace has to fall.
Well, and I wonder too, and I could be wrong on this, but from where I sat in my former role, a lot of the folks that were selling payment cards and hacking into big box retailers to steal payment cards to sell them migrated over to ransomware because it was easier to monetize.
Correct.
So
Correct.
when we are, and this is the $1 million question, is when we're able to really counter ransomware, where are they going next? They're not going to go home. They're going to go do something else. And I guess we just have to wait and see what that something else is. Any idea what that next thing will be?
Oh, I am already seeing this in some spaces. Phishing and AI.
Okay.
Uh, Directly get to the source of the money and fleece them, right? Why go through this is the sort of retail attack, essentially. And with AI, this has become really, really dangerous.
Yes.
Because it can get very specific if it starts getting information about your social media profiles and things like that, right? And so what comes at you is is a much more complicated attack than the usual Nigerian prince emails that we used to get back in the era, right?
Yeah, and with the ability of bad actors to leverage the AI that they have for voice impersonation, the whole your voice is your password needs to go away because clearly that's not a successful strategy. And their
Correct.
ability to use very cheap tools in order to do facial recognition kind of cloning and then tie
Correct.
that to LLMs. And now all of a
That's easy.
sudden you have no idea who you're talking to online.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I have seen some initial attacks over there. They have been slow and not able to keep up really with real time. But my expectation is 1 or 2 generations into the future, yeah, this is going to be quite.
Yes. Yeah. So, all right. So,
Turing test, we will have the reverse Turing test. Identify
yeah.
yourself as a human somehow.
Yes, exactly. And always like I always just tell people like, hey, it's something you know. So even if it's your family, just come up with a code word like, hey, my
Yeah,
code
yeah.
word is this, whatever it is,
Yes.
and then therefore they can't replicate it no matter
Correct.
what happens. I was talking to a reporter just yesterday about the old. It's not old. Well, it continues to evolve, but essentially the phone call claiming to be a family member that was in an accident and they need money and things like that. And it was the actual family member's voice that they got because they were targeting the real estate industry because realtors post so much on social media. They just pulled off, 30 seconds of it and used that. Because the other
Simple.
thing is the real estate industry is not all that sophisticated with all of the scams and things like that. So it's
Correct.
a perfect recipe because their whole business is being online and being accessible and all that other stuff. So
That is correct.
yeah, it's really interesting that we're going to go back to essentially BECs and we're going to go back to CEO impersonations in the coming years. And that to your point, that's a lot harder to defend unless you have that sort of different kind of defense in depth where you have multiple controls inside your organizations before you send money.
Multi-factor on everything.
Yes,
Uh,
but not
and
SMS, like
yeah,
real
not
multi-factor, right? Yes. Okay.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Code at the end of the day, some challenge handshake.
Yes.
So something better than a text message. Yes.
Yes, yes. Well, Srinidhi, this has been an incredible conversation. You've helped us understand not only where cloud protection stands today, but where it's heading and why thinking strategically about resilience matters more than ever. For listeners who want to learn more, check out elastio.com and follow Elastio's research and webinars. They publish some fantastic technical insights on cloud security and data recovery. Srinidhi, thank you so much for joining us. And to our audience, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow or subscribe for more deep dive conversations with the people shaping the future of technology.